Is HRV a meaningful marker for long-term cardiovascular health and longevity?
That's $1 million question. And
HRV, is higher actually better, or are we reading it wrong? Why do some runners see bad HRV and still perform their best? What impacts HRV more? Training load or life stress? What if everything you know about HRV is wrong? Dr. Marco Altini spent the last 15 years studying HRV and working with elite athletes, Olympic medalists, and over 200,000 users through his platform HRV for Training. He's one of the few people who really understands HRV, and when most people get it wrong.
A lot of people expect that, and that is typically the opposite of a good response.
Why HRV? There are many ways that you could have carved a career in sports physiology. Why did you choose HRV?
True. By chance, I would say. At the beginning, I didn't have any, plan to pick this thing in particular. I was exposed to a series of different signals and things you could measure from the body, and brain waves, and heart activity and muscular activity through some of the work I did at the beginning of my career. And with heart rate variability, I felt like it was something that really piqued my interest because of the link to stress, and maybe me being a bit of an anxious person or someone that would not handle stress very well. At that point, I would say professionally more than in the context of athletic performance. I started later training and doing endurance training and things like that. So at the beginning, maybe it was more trying to understand better how stress impacts our body. And this signal gave us a window into that. And also from a practical point of view, right? Many other things you couldn't really measure in a simple way, right? So there's other signals that are interesting, but I cannot look at certain signals in ways that are non-invasive or that you can do at the required frequency on a daily basis, and see how the body is responding to the various things that we do. I think it checked a few boxes for me. It was something that had long track record also of scientific research, but at the same time was not obvious. So how to use it or how to interpret it, I think that also has changed in the past 10, 15 years in a way that now we know more than we did back then, even though it was already used for a long time. So in a way, in all this journey, it kept it interesting for me, right? Because there was a solid background in physiology, but at the same time, I was always stimulated in trying to understand it better and see how we could use this data more effectively. So that's a bit, I think, how it ended up being.
So HRV seems to be always tracked alongside resting heart rate. At least most of the apps would always track HRV. Or when you do a HRV reading, you would also be reading your resting heart rate. Why should someone still pay attention to resting heart rate, given the advancement in HRV? 30 years ago, people were tracking their resting heart rate as an indicative of how well they're recovering after training. But now with HRV, why are we still tracking that? And how should we interpret that pairing of HRV and resting heart rate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because both signals matter and they can be used slightly differently, and that is not always obvious. For example, the way you mentioned that it was done in the past by looking at resting heart rate and HRV come from the same data, from bit-to-bit data collected over a period of time, which could be even just a minute in the morning. And then we analyze these data a bit differently. Heart rate is just the average of the bit-to-bit differences, basically. And HRV, we look at how these consecutive heartbeats are actually changing over time, because they are modulated by breathing, and they are modulated, most importantly, by the nervous system in a way that it captures our stress response. And if we face a very strong stressor, say we are sick, then probably everybody knows that their heart rate is elevated. So the stress response is obvious also in heart rate. But if the stressor is a bit more subtle, which could be even training, then the response in heart rate might not be so obvious. So it could be that heart rate doesn't change much, or maybe it changes by, 1 bit, which is normal day-to-day variability. You cannot distinguish, is it the stressor, or is just, a difference today with respect to yesterday. HRV due to the way it is computed, looks at these high frequency changes in bit-to-bit data, which are modulated, again, by the nervous system in response to stress, in a way that basically the bit-to-bit data, the time series, becomes more constant when we have more stress, while we have more variability when we have less stress. And so this change is not captured by the average because it's averaged out by definition, especially because it's synchronous with the respiration. So heart rate increases a bit when we breathe in and reduces as we breathe out. So over a minute, there are oscillations that when we compute heart rate, we cancel them out because it's just the average. When we look at HRV, we basically highlight these differences that happen through the breathing cycle. And that allows us to capture with a bit more sensitivity the stress response. That means that if the stressor is lower, but still important because there is a response in the body, then we can see that in HRV data in a way that we cannot see it necessarily in heart rate data. But this does not mean that heart rate is just not useful because it's just a less important version of our stress response. There are other things that heart rate, for example, can capture typically better than HRV. For example, if we start training, we have changes in cardiorespiratory fitness. Our VO2 max might increase. These changes are captured better by resting heart rate than are captured in HRV data. So over time, we might see changes in heart rate that are more tightly coupled to changes in our fitness, while HRV is more coupled to changes, for example, in training load and in our response to the load, and not necessarily to fitness. So there are some differences in there, in their long-term meaning. But even on a day-to-day basis, I think it's useful to look at both because, for example, if we have a suppression in HRV, the data is a bit lower. We know it means we have not responded well to a certain stressor. But if we look also at heart rate, and that is normal, then maybe there is less concern, right? Because if we had a very strong stressor, we were getting sick, it would be likely that also heart rate is elevated. While if it is remaining normal and HRV is a bit suppressed, maybe we can also keep going and then see what happens the day after. If we are normalized, all good. And that way we have, two signals to look at that have slightly different meaning and slightly different sensitivity to stress. Used together, I think they are more useful than either of the signals alone.
Let me just throw that back at you to see if I understood what you just said correctly. So HRV is a little bit more sensitive than resting heart rate in terms of fluctuations and showing how your body is responding to stresses. And in that light, if there's a fluctuation in HRV, you would also look at resting heart rate to see how much changes resting heart rate moves from your baseline to help you determine the level of that stressor and how it's affecting your body than just taking one metric by itself. And heart rate is still a good measure of cardiorespiratory fitness improvements because that is a bit more tied towards improvements in VO2 max or improvements in threshold or something like that. Am I correct? If you're still tracking your fat loss progress using just body weight, you're probably missing what actually matters. The scale only tells you how much you weigh. It doesn't tell you if that weight is coming from fat or from muscle. As we get older, the distinction matters because losing muscle affects your performance, your durability, and your long-term health. That's where something like the Hume body pod becomes useful. Instead of just giving you a single number, it shows you what your body is actually made of. You can see how your muscle mass is changing in contrast to how your body fat is trending over time. So instead of guessing, the Hume body pod gives you data that reflects what's really changing. It measures your body composition from home with a level of accuracy that's normally only available in clinics with expensive DEXA scanners. If you want to try it, Hume has a deal for my audience. Use code ENDURANCELAB for 20% off. It also stacks with Hume's current sale, so savings can go up to 50% total. The code's valid for 7 days, and if you're in the US, it's HSA and FSA eligible. Thanks to Hume Health for sponsoring this episode. And heart rate is still a good measure of cardiorespiratory fitness improvements because that is a bit more tied towards improvements in VO2 max or improvements in threshold or something like that. Am I correct?
Yep, that's right. Also, the way the heart changes in your response to training, it will be captured better by heart rate, your stroke volume improves, right? Increases. So you pump more blood per cycle and then heart rate reduces. So there is a tight link between just heart rate and fitness changes, which is not necessarily there for HRV. Yeah.
And the different ways to capture HRV, I understand the most common one used for sports or in the context of sports is RMSSD. Why is that the chosen one, and how does that compare to the other algorithms of capturing heart rate variability? I believe is the other ones SD, NN, and L and RMSSD?
Yeah, so there's various ways, as you mentioned, to basically given a series of bit-to-bit data, we summarize it in a number, right? And this number represents the variability in the data. And based on the algorithm that we use to compute this heart rate variability, we have, in a way, different insights. But while historically, a lot of things have been looked at in terms of, again, ways to summarize this variability in a numbers, formulas to look at, how the bit-to-bit data changes. I think over the years, we learned that HRV physiologically is more linked to the activity of the parasympathetic nervous system, so the one in charge of rest and relaxation, except, the other part would be the sympathetic nervous system that is active when we need action, so to speak. So the parasympathetic nervous system acts at a very high frequency. Again, typically there is more activity during the exhale in the breathing cycle. And so basically the math that we use to compute HRV in the case of RMSSD, one of these, we call them indices or features, is capturing these high frequency changes better than using other formulas. So eventually, the math is more tightly coupled to the physiology. And that's why it becomes more meaningful to use this with respect to others like SDNN or other ways, frequency domain features, and so on. And all of them are representative of variability, of course. So it's not that it changes dramatically. If we look at data over time, we probably see very similar trends between different features, right? Between different indices. But still, RMSSD is a strong candidate because of its link to the physiology. It's also easy to compute, which helps because then all the tools do it in the same way. So it's also helping standardizing this measurement. While when we were looking at frequency domain analysis, that's a more complex math where you have lots of degrees of freedom. So you can do it in many different ways. And that makes it so that it's also difficult to compare results from different studies or different tools computing these numbers. So I think there's various advantages in using RMSSD. It's also a bit less sensitive to changes in breathing rate, even though that will always impact the data. So in general, there's, again, different ways, but this is probably best. And sometimes it's expressed in terms of the logarithms. So as you said, LN RMSSD, that would not change anything basically in the interpretation of the data for an individual looking at the data over time. It's a transformation typically done also when we look at maybe population level data differences between people, but at the same time, it comes from the same parameter, which is RMSSD. So that's typically what we look at due to its stronger link to the physiology.
Okay. And is it safe to say that that's the most common capture
for sure
algorithm, RMSSD?
I would say, both in the wearables, in apps, and also in scientific literature of the past years, especially the recent past, let's say, I think is the one that is used the most.
And in light of training, or when someone is making training decisions for the day, a lot of people measure their HRV every morning, or they have variables that tell them what their HRV is when they wake up. At what point does the changes in HRV tell someone that they should make a change to their training decision for the day? How much fluctuation should someone see before they should change what their plan is for the day? You might relate to this. Have you ever had a stretch where your training is progressing well? Then you do one big hard workout and everything changes. You're sore for days, you feel flat, something starts to hurt, or you just can't quite hit the paces you were hitting a week ago. That doesn't happen because the workout was bad. It happens because adaptation and recovery at midlife simply aren't the same as they were at 25. Here's what most masters runners miss. It's not the big workouts that move you forward, but the steady compounding of training weeks you can repeat. When training builds gradually through small increases, controlled efforts, and proper spacing between harder sessions, your running performance improves. That approach took me from a complete beginner to a sub 20 minute 5K, a 40 minute 10K, and a 305 marathon, all within just 2 years in my late 40s. Nothing extreme, just structured progression designed for this stage of life. So, if you want to stop guessing and follow a plan that builds you up instead of breaks you down, I've created simple, structured plans for 5K, 10K, half, and full marathon, each aligned to specific goal finish times. Pick a goal, follow the structure, start building properly this week. You find the plans through the link below. At what point does the changes in HRV tell someone that they should make a change to their training decision for the day? How much fluctuation should someone see before they should change what their plan is for the day?
Yeah. So I think this has changed over the years in terms of how we look at the data and how we interpret it. I think the most important thing is to use a tool that basically allows you to record data for a long time first, several weeks, up to typically 1 to 2 months. That data is then used to define your normal range. That would be basically a frame of reference on which we compare and analyze the data on a daily basis. Because for HRV, there is no universal frame of reference, or there is not even a frame of reference for people similar to you, your age group and things like that. It's really, there's a lot of it that is genetically sort of established. So your absolute value could be on a very large scale, even regardless of your fitness level, as we said earlier, not particularly representative of that. And so we need to interpret the data with respect to your own frame of reference, your own normal values, and you can do that only by collecting data for so long that that frame of reference can be established. At that point, indeed, we have the opportunity to decide what to do with the data, right? So if we have a suppression today, shall we implement a change or not? Typically, we look at changes outside of your normal range as changes that are meaningful, meaning there is an actual suppression in HRV that is not just day-to-day variability. The suppression is larger than your normal range, meaning that, again, on a day-to-day basis, there is variability. But if we go below that, then there is really a negative stress response. And so the body has not rebounded back to normal within a reasonable time, as we expect it to be after we've faced, training and lifestyle stressors. And so at that point, with this suppression, we can decide, okay, shall we implement a change in our training? And historically in research, this change, the daily change, which we could call also the acute change, meaning that, it is just one data point outside of your normal, was used to trigger a change in the training. While more recently, we have an approach that is a bit less reactive. So instead of having one data point that is outside of your normal, today's data point, for example, we wait for your baseline to be outside of your normal. And your baseline typically is a week of data. So a weekly average. And that as such is a bit of a more stable signal, right? Because for your weekly average to go below your normal range, of course, you need a couple of bad days. It's not just one single data point. Once we have, 2 or 3 suppressions, typically then the whole average goes down. And that is a stronger signal. We could call it a more chronic negative stress response. And that is what is used these days in research on HRV guided training to determine, okay, today we change the training. And then we can talk about what that means, what change you should make. But that's a bit how it starts and when you should make it according to the research.
How much change, I don't know whether you can give me in terms of percentage, that someone should be looking for from their baseline before they make a decision on whether they should change their training? The reason why I'm asking this is because my weekly baseline moves week to week as well. So it doesn't stay straight all the way. It might go up 1 week, it comes down, it goes up. So there is still that variation. So how much should it vary before we should make a change, or we should take some action?
Yeah, so that is also highly individual. And that's why I think there is the whole concept of the normal range, because then if your data has a lot of variability, let's say the normal range is the average of your data plus or minus one standard deviation. So it's just a statistical summary of your data. So if you have a lot of variability, your normal range is just wider automatically. And then if your data is more constant across days, then your normal range is going to be narrower, because automatically it captures how much variability is in your data. So it's not a fixed way to do it in general, but it depends on your historical data. And once you have that normal range, then the baseline also will move inside that normal range. And when it gets out, because of, for example, multiple suppressions, then we implement the change. But we need first to create that frame of reference specifically for you, because otherwise we cannot determine when a change is meaningful.
So the variance day to day and week to week, or the delta of the variance is very individualized.
That's right.
So some people will have a bigger variance and some will have a smaller variance.
Yes.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about using HRV to decide when to implement high intensity sessions, be it VO2 max or thresholds, compared to just aerobic training.
I think the strongest evidence from research is more on the holding back more than when to push hard. What I mean is that most studies have looked at using HRV as your stress response to determine when your body is not ready to assimilate additional stress because you are in a negative stress response, so your HRV is suppressed. It does not mean that you cannot execute the training. Like you could be, doing the best session of your life, but your body is already very stressed. So it's unlikely that you will respond positively to that stressor. So if it is a race, you don't care because you're going to do it and then you're going to rest. But if you are building with your training and you want to improve with your training, then you might improve more if you skip a hard session on a day in which HRV is suppressed, because you might not respond positively to that stressor in a way that will lead to improvements. And this has been tested in many studies so far, in which basically two groups of people train according to a similar periodization, and one of them will just do the periodization and the other one will do it, but it's going to be HRV guided. So if there is a suppression, they will skip the hard training typically. And at the end of the study, what we see is always that either it's the same or the group that skipped the extra training, the hard training, actually performs better, which tells you that it's not just about the training that you do, but also about when you do it, which I think intuitively we know not every day is the same, not every week is the same. Sometimes we have capacity for more training and to assimilate training and respond well and make progress, and sometimes we don't. And in those situations, we are better off probably just doing lower intensity training as opposed to pushing through for basically no gains. So that's a bit the principle. And the way this is executed is typically by scaling down the intensity. So if we have a suppression and in our daily data or in our baseline, depending on the approach that we use, then we will try basically to reduce the intensity of the workout. It's not that we have to, lie on the couch. If we are an athlete that train very high volume every day, it's more about how we manage the intensity, because intensity, it is what causes a disruption in autonomic activity and basically will lead to a long time to bounce back to homeostasis, to basically to a state of stability and renormalize all your physiological data. So it's not training per se, it's just hard training that causes that. And there are even studies looking at HRV before and after training. And for easy training, even easy long training, if the intensity is really low, let's say below the first threshold, then we have a renormalization within a few minutes. So in your autonomic nervous system data, let's say a proxy of it, which is resting heart rate and HRV, you see no changes when you do an easy training, or HRV even increases after the session. While if you do hard training, which could be anything basically above the first threshold, like moderate intensity or very high intensity, but still hard training, then you have a suppression, and that suppression takes time to recover, and that time it takes is also dependent on your fitness. So the fitter you are, and then the quicker it will bounce back to normal, which is also why very fit athletes and elite athletes can take a lot of training and high intensity training because, they renormalize very quickly. So it's not that they go very hard on a body that is extremely tired or fatigued or is responding negatively to stress. They just respond very well, very quickly, and that's why they can do the training. And otherwise, that's the moment in which, we try to modulate intensity. So that is the whole let's use HRV to slow down, which I think is backed by a lot of research. The pushing harder side of things, I think it's more complex, especially because, again, pushing harder has a lot of implications. So in terms of injury risk and, overtraining and, just stressing the body a lot. So when you talk about HRV in that context, sometimes people think that they can just go off HRV without having a plan, while you should always start with a training plan, which includes, structured training, hard sessions, easy sessions, and so on. And if you're in a period in which HRV is particularly good, and physically also you're good from a musculoskeletal point of view, for example, right? There is no niggles and other issues. Then a period of higher baseline HRV might signal also that you have more capacity for training, for higher intensity training, or for doing more, but not necessarily on a given day, more in a training block kind of situation, so bigger picture. But again, that is always tricky, right? Because if a person has capacity for 2 hard sessions per week, let's say, and more always lead to issues, maybe the person could do 1 more session from a nervous system point of view. But then other parts, again, maybe the tendons do not agree with that.
Might fall apart. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's very tricky, and I tend to prefer to use HRV just to hold back a few times. And if things are looking good. It means the plan, which already was thought with the athlete in mind and their capacity, is going well, and the athlete is responding well. But I wouldn't necessarily overload them unless we have safe ways to do that, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe we are talking about a runner and they're doing very well, and we could add a hard session on the bike, right? So that is minimal risk, and we really try to tap into that capacity. So, then there's many different, let's say, more training considerations, more than HRV considerations, but, the data could signal that there is room for capacity. But it's much harder, I think, to use it that way than just to hold back sometimes, which is, of course, safe.
So it's safe to still push through suppressed HRV. But if we push through suppressed HRV, we may not be getting the adaptations of the effort that we put into that session because of the suppressed HRV. But it is not, quote unquote, dangerous to still race hard, for example, if you have a day of suppressed HRV. Is that a correct summary of what you were saying? So
in general, yes, I wouldn't read too much into, especially into single suppression. It could be anything, maybe something you ate yesterday night, you didn't digest well, right? It's just a stress response. So it's nothing catastrophic. So we shouldn't read too much into it. At the same time, the body is complex. Sometimes it is telling us something. So maybe there is high inflammation and, there's HRV suppressed because something is wrong, and maybe the higher load could lead to other issues, injuries. So, and it's not that by using this signal you will not have injuries, right? It's not so simple. Again, the body is a very complex biological system. But what I want to say is that we like to use simple rules, but it's not so simple. So yes, with a low HRV, typically, if you feel good, right, because a low HRV, again, could be also that you're getting sick. So in that case, no point pushing through. But let's say that you feel good and it just have a suppression, which could be linked to a number of reasons. Typically, it is no issue. You could do your session, even if it is training. And then the day after, if everything is normal again, great. If it stays suppressed, then maybe we are building some chronic stress. And it's a good idea to make some changes. But, we should always think about all the context around it. Typically, we could think of what leads to a suppression or not. And some cases it's a bit more difficult to pinpoint the cause. It's not it's not always straightforward.
Is there any research that shows that suppressed HRV for a runner could indicate a potential running injury downstream?
Specifically in runners, I'm not aware of research that looks into that. In other sports, we've seen something, very small studies. One also I participated in years ago, looking, for example, at the combination of training load, we could say. So acute and chronic training loads, so just how much you did recently with respect to what you're used to do, right? And HRV. Mm-hmm. And there, for example, we could see that we had higher injury risk when HRV was suppressed if you had a higher acute load as well. So it's a combination of the two, right? Okay. You're doing more than what you're normally doing, and your body's in a negative stress response. The combination of the two increases your injury risk. So I think those things, because eventually, again, HRV is just a proxy of your stress response. It could be linked to inflammation, it could be linked to a sort of issues. And so maybe it's fine to do what you're used to doing. But if you're doing more, you're stressing your body even more in that period, then maybe that is not a good idea. So if you're, if the data is suppressed, shows higher stress, and then it's a week in which you train twice what you normally train, probably not a great idea.
As someone ages, let's say someone goes from their 40s to their 50s and then to their 60s, is there typically a decline in HRV every decade? This summer, I turned 48 and I'm targeting my first sub-3-hour marathon. That means I'm looking at every lever that can support performance and recovery without adding more training mileage or intensity. Over the last 6 weeks, I've been experimenting with the isocapnic BWB as part of my training. I've been using it in two main ways. First, I've been doing breathing sessions with the app while sitting relaxed. The research behind this device shows it helps you increase ventilation while keeping carbon dioxide stable. In simple terms, it trains your breathing system in a steady and safe way. The second way I've been using it is in between high intensity intervals. After a hard rep, I take 5 to 10 seconds to let my breathing settle before I use the bag during the recovery interval for 2 minutes at a steady rhythm before the next interval. The idea behind this is to train the breathing muscles and regain control faster between hard efforts. Research suggests that this type of breathing work can improve breathing efficiency and support endurance performance over time. Now, here's what I noticed. At my goal marathon pace, which is just under 4 minutes 15 seconds per kilometer or 6 minutes 50 seconds per mile, my breathing feels more controlled. At that pace, I used to run in the 2-2 rhythm, 2 steps inhale and 2 steps exhale. Lately, I've naturally shifted into more of a 3-3 rhythm without forcing it. With my breathing rate being slower and steadier, it feels like I'm using slightly less effort to manage my breathing. It's still early, but I'm seeing small shifts, and in endurance training, small shifts can compound into big results. It's interesting how respiratory training can potentially move the needle without increasing total training load. Only time will tell if it helps me break 3 hours this summer, but for now, it's staying as part of my overall training approach. If you'd like to try the isocapnic BWB yourself, they set up a deal for my audience. Use code JUSTMANSO at checkout and you get 10% off. Click the link below and start training your breathing the same way you train your heart and your legs. Is there typically a decline in HRV every decade?
That's right. So as we were mentioning earlier, there is a strong genetic component in HRV, so the absolute values are really all over the place for people even of very different ages. But if we really want to find one thing at the population level that shows a change in HRV that is quite obvious, that is actually there, that would be aging. So over the decades, HRV will reduced. It might mean, that is just autonomic function that is not as it used to be, right? That would make sense. I think that's interesting also because other signals like heart rate do not show this pattern. So your heart rate, even as you age, is more strongly linked to your physical activity behavior, let's say. So if you exercise all the time, your heart rate, maybe when you are in your 20s is 45, and when you are in your 60s is also 45. but your HRV
Okay.
might be a half of what you used to be, right? So we see different patterns there. I think that's quite relevant. We also published some work showing this data, so on a large data set, so we see it quite consistently. Physical activity shows very well in heart rate over decades, while HRV tends to decrease across the population.
How much does it decrease every decade? Do you know?
No, not really.
Or is that all over the place as well and it's individual?
Yeah, because there is so much
Okay.
variability. So, we could say
Okay.
10%, 15%, but then some people will be stable
Okay.
for decades and some people will go down, because then it depends also on our behavior changes. Our health might change, our environment might change, right? So for each individual, all of these factors then play a big role.
How can someone put an effort to trying to maintain a higher level of HRV as they age? And also, how can someone try to improve their HRV within a block of time, within 3 months or within 6 months? Not due to aging, but if someone wants to bring their level of HRV up, their baseline up, are there meaningful ways of doing that in the short term? And are there meaningful ways of doing that in the long term? And when I say long term, as in a decade or in 2 decades?
Yeah, I would say for both cases, we need to look at the basis of a healthy lifestyle. I think that's where the evidence is. So physical activity in moderate amounts, right? So following basic guidelines, that would work. And then a healthy diet, sleep, the sleep that we need, right? That is also different for different people, but trying to feel rested at the end of the night. I would say these three for sure, the main ones. And then there's other things that might have an impact. And of course, these are things we might be able to control in certain situations, again, depending on our environment and so on. But there's a lot also there that is just stress, right? Life stress, work stress, family stress, like those things matter, right? It's not uncommon to hear, the very stressed professional that is concerned for their HRV, and you try to eat well, exercise, and so on, but then life is so busy, so to speak, and so stressful. And maybe that is the elephant in the room, right? So we cannot just use these tools if our life is extremely stressful, and that is the default that we live in, right? So those factors all play a huge role. So we need, in a way, whenever possible, to find that balance that allows us not to be constantly in a chronic stressed state mentally and physically. And then again, the diet, the sleep, the exercise, and maybe things like meditation or slow breathing, like all things that still in a way stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system and resting state, in a way we could call it, where we sort of decompress a bit from, again, life. So those kind of things can have an impact, at least acutely as you do it, but possibly also chronically over time.
Which has a higher impact on HRV? Is it training stress or life stress?
Yeah, so in general, from my experience, it is difficult for training to be the problem, to cause the largest suppressions and things like that. Even elite athletes that train a lot, when they have a suppression, is because something in life is happening. And also for regular people, training maybe is even a stress relief at times. And again, life is busy with commitments, family, work, all sorts of things that are demanding and stress us out. So HRV is applied a lot in the training context, and I think rightfully so, because training is a stressor we can adjust, right? So that is the key. I think that is why we use it with training, right? Because if you don't care about training and you measure your HRV, it is as valuable because it's just a stress response signal. But then if work is really stressful, if there is a chronic health condition, if there is another issue or something, family, so on and so on, often you cannot do much about that, right? So you have a situation to go through that, at least lasts much longer than a training session. So it is much harder to use the data effectively. While with training, it's very easy because the suppression HRV might be due to life, not to training. But then I can adjust training as a response to avoid making things worse. So, it matches well because we can just use it and adjust it. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that training is the stressor that will show up in the data. Typically, most people using the data, they use it to see when things don't go well, when there is something unexpected, when you're traveling, when you're also for athletes and so on. And now that impacts your body beyond the day-to-day routine of training, which should be, planned according to your capacities and typically not lead to issues.
I think a lot of people don't always appreciate how much life stress affects training and performance.
True.
You talked a bit about breathing just now as a stress reliever, and I believe you were speaking to breathing in the light of relaxation, a meditative state. But if we looked at breathing from the other end of the spectrum, let's say respiratory muscle training and training for improved CO2 tolerance, does that have a measurable influence on HRV?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not aware of much research looking into this. So
Okay.
again, it could be chronically, just like slow breathing, in theory, affects the parasympathetic nervous system in a way that you could see a change. It could be also that if you work on, you do breath holds or box breathing or other forms that could also work on CO2 tolerance and so on, you might also see changes. But I'm not aware of, let's say, strong evidence looking into this in studies that also look at things longitudinally over time, right? Because often things are looked at for a very short time before, after the session. Well, I think it would be more interesting to look at what happens in the weeks and months of doing something, right? Could be. I mean, eventually it's just the autonomic nervous system, a proxy to it. And so it's difficult to do something that doesn't touch it, right? Because anything, it's like when we talk about stress and stressors, right? Anything is a stressor, mentally, physically, and so in our environment. So we are unable typically to tell which one is which and what is impacting what, but something is happening. Yeah.
Correct. We can isolate it, right? We can isolate one variable because everything affects, or everything kind of comes down and is connected to the central nervous system. To this, okay. Is there a link between HRV and metabolic health or metabolic flexibility?
So I would say that in general, yes. If we think about, again, just HRV as a proxy of the nervous system response and our stress response, typically we have from the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is impacted, and as such, heart rate variability. But we have also a hormonal response, right? So in periods of high stress, for example, our blood glucose will be elevated, right? Just like after eating certain types of foods, that would also lead to that response. So it's all interconnected. It's just that typically we cannot look at all of these things easily and non-invasively. Right now we have continuous glucose monitors, which can help us see some of these changes. But at the same time, again, it's not only these two signals, right? Because then we have these and we think everything is in there, but then, maybe we should look also at cortisol or other hormones and see, what is happening in the body. But for sure, there are differences, and also in people that have metabolic conditions and, chronic diseases, we have typically that HRV, even at the group level, tends to be lower than in a healthy state. So there's links there. But also within an individual, again, in response to various stressors. So we see those changes in the data. So I think we can think of HRV as a bit of an overall marker of our stress response to various situations, also, exercise, various stressors, metabolic health, and so on. But the trick is always to try to look at it within, again, your frame of reference, not as a value where you have to reach a certain other value, because that might just not be possible. And also to remember that there are changes that are even at the very long time scale, for example, over seasons. You were mentioning earlier, you live in Finland. So for example, in places where there is very strong seasonality, right? So winter and summer are very different. There is a change in our physiology that goes along with that, right? So it's linked, to differences in temperatures, sunlight, all sorts of things. But that means that typically in summer, our heart rate is a bit lower, our HRV is a bit higher, and in winter, the other way around. And that's important to remember because, if it is October or November and you say, hey, I want to implement some healthy habits, you make some changes, and then it's December and January, your HRV is the same or worse, right? Just because it's winter and you're going through that change, then it shouldn't mean that your habits are not good for you, right? So we really need to use it more as a day-to-day feedback or a week-by-week feedback, more than this outcome measure that people really want to look at, like if that's the value to optimize. But not really. I think it's more about our stress response over time, so that we adjust things and we try to basically keep HRV stable. Because if our stress response is good, we face stressors, we are normalized by the morning after when we measure our HRV, or by the night after, and then the data remains stable. And I think stability is really the positive response, more than a value that goes higher. Because again, there's also seasonality and all sorts of things that impact the data. So if you're looking at your own data, I think try to see if the trend is stable and in which response to what stressors you have larger suppressions, more than trying to get your HRV higher by this time, because that might be meaningless.
For someone that lives in higher latitudes, through the change between summer and winter, do you think it's the temperature that causes that effect on HRV, or is it the sunlight?
Of the two, maybe more the sunlight. Like the temperature, I wouldn't say that
I
necessarily
was thinking
leads
it's
to a
more the
negative.
sunlight.
Yeah, I would think the same.
Yeah. Can HRV meaningfully predict overtraining syndrome? I know a lot of people might be thinking, I run 20, 30 kilometers a week, or maybe 50. I'm not an elite athlete. I'm not going to be overtraining. But I see it as, if you're running 50 kilometers a week and you go up to 90, you might be overtraining, compared to an elite that's running 120 kilometers per week, going up to 140. So I think it's relative, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's how I see it, and that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, for sure it's relative. So if we are running 30, 40 kilometers per week, because that's our capacity right now, then doing more basically goes beyond our capacity. So again, it's not really the absolute, it's more like what can we do sustainably and staying healthy and our body recovering at the right time. So while there isn't a simple way, again, to just use HRV to avoid these issues, typically HRV tracks well with our response to training load, right? More than fitness, as you were saying earlier. So if we increase load beyond our capacity, it tends to show more in this type of data. So if we load quite a bit, we do more intensity, more training with respect to what we are used to, it could be that we see it there. Especially if we see a negative response, then maybe it's a good idea to slow down. While if it stays stable, for example, that we said is a good response, then maybe we have the capacity to take this additional training. So more than overtraining, I would say, also because overtraining is a very complex situation also to diagnose. But I would say with changes in training load, yes, that's when it can be very useful, I think. So overload and those kind of situations, then it can give us some useful insights typically.
Well, when someone is training for a race, whether it's a marathon or half marathon, maybe a 5K, we tend to build our load up until we reach a peak before we go down to a taper. How would HRV respond during the taper period where the training volume is decreased? Should people be expecting a rebound in HRV during the taper?
This is a great question because a lot of people expect that. And that is typically the opposite of a good response.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
basically, it just makes sense to think that way. Like, okay, I reduce training and then HRV tracks training load, so it goes higher. But I think that happens only if you messed up before. Meaning that if your build, you were unable to cope well with it, so that your HRV kept going down as you were building. And then you really need a break, and the taper allows you maybe to renormalize. But that typically is not a good situation. The good situation is when you increase training load and your HRV is stable or is even increasing together with training load. That would be the ideal sign of a good response to a build for before a race. So HRV goes up with the load. Also because with increased load, we hope it comes with increased fitness, maybe increased blood volume, which also correlates with HRV. So physiological parameters change in a way that HRV should be stable or increasing. And then you slow down with the training, you reduce the volume, you do the taper, and maybe there is also a change in blood volume, but in the opposite direction, so it reduces. And so HRV might go down that week, which simply means, before you had an increase and then it renormalizes basically with respect to what it was before. And that is typically a good sign. So it's the opposite maybe of what most people expect.
Okay.
But and that's why it's important also to discuss. If HRV is lower on race week, it should be no concern. Also, race week is a strange week, right? So there's psychological stressors. You are indeed not training much, which adds psychological stress. And all sorts of things are different. Maybe you're even traveling to a different location and then your diet is a bit different. So I think while the data might be interesting for you to look at later, it's not that it would change much about what you're doing at that point. And so you shouldn't really worry about it. But what happens before, as you build, I think then is very informative. Like there, you really want to see that the data is nice and stable or even increasing.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I have taken the approach of not looking or not checking my HRV 2 weeks up to a race, so it doesn't mess with my head.
Yeah, that's a good idea, I think. Because anyway, if you're not doing anything with it, then there's no point just getting stressed about it.
Okay. We talked a bit earlier about trying to maintain a high HRV as we age. Is HRV a meaningful marker for long-term cardiovascular health and longevity? Is that something that we can use to track?
I think that's $1 million question, and people really want to use it that way. Like it's always thrown out there for that. Like, is this great marker of your cardiovascular health and so on? I'm not so convinced, I have to say. So HRV has proven to be a useful day-to-day tool to track stress responses. In terms of its absolute value, I think we are reading way too much into it with respect to what the evidence is. And I think we can see this in many situations when we look at studies that look at people that have, for example, a specific health condition and healthy controls. So we look at two groups, and the HRV is often an outcome. And, the headlines will be, people with depression have lower HRV and things like that. But then if you look at the data, the range of values of these two groups is basically the same. So yes, statistically, there is a difference. But the values, maybe in one group, they go from 10 to 80, and the other goes from 15 to 85. So yes, there is a difference. And if the sample is large enough, it's statistically significant and blah, blah, blah. But then if I tell you my HRV, I can be in either groups. It's almost impossible to have a value that is only belonging to one of the groups, right? Only the very extremes. And even there, what does that mean, right? Maybe it's just an outlier. So I think that given how much people stress about this, and everybody, that knows less and read this kind of news, checks their HRV in their wearable or whatever they use, and maybe the value is on the lower end of the population, maybe 20 milliseconds or something like that. And sometimes there's very meaningful psychological implications, like people can really get seriously concerned and basically make their health worse just by knowing this number, when I would say there isn't any very strong evidence that this should be a concern. And again, if you look at different groups, even the ones that have a specific chronic health condition and specific disease or things like that, typically the values are all over the place, like it's all over the place for the healthy people. So I think in general there is really too much reading into that and very little, if no evidence that we should. So I would always look at the data more in relative terms, use the daily feedback to understand how your body responds to things, make some adjustments so that you keep things in balance better. The healthy choices you make might reflect typically in a more stable data more than a higher data and things like that.
So it's better used to track. It's better used to give you an indication of what to do now than whether you'll be living 10 years longer.
I would think so, yeah.
In terms of measuring the HRV through wearables or through apps, over the years, I've been using many different apps. Some require me to be wearing a strap before I can measure it. I've got it on my watch, and lately I've been using HRV for training, which is very simple because you don't have to put a strap on. You just turn on the light on your phone and it measures it. Is there a difference between morning spot measurements, that is doing the measurement when you first wake up in the morning, when you're still kind of in a rested state, or overnight wearables that track your HRV throughout the whole night?
Yeah, so I think there are two main differences that are important to understand for people using this data. One is simply due to measurement timing. So obviously the night comes before the morning. So as such, the night tends to track better your behavior, what you did before. Your previous evening, maybe you had some alcohol, you had a late dinner, you exercised in the evening. It tends to show in the data just because there isn't enough time for the body to renormalize because you are measuring shortly after. In the morning, I think the data is more representative of your capacity to handle stress that day. So it's more useful to adjust training because it also comes after the restorative effect of sleep. And we can see sleep as a positive stressor. So yes, you had the previous stressor day, but then you also had sleep that helps you recover. And then you measure at that time. And I think at that point, then your body's capacity for that day is what you can see. And so if you have a suppression in the night, maybe you're fine in the morning. And that's a meaningful difference. So measuring in the night with a wearable, of course, you need to do no work. So it's convenient, it's easy. For some people, it might be the only way. Their morning is particularly hectic and they cannot spare 2 minutes to measure their data. It is also useful, right? In the long term, the two are very similar, right? Because these small day-to-day differences eventually sort of average out as we look at long-term changes. But then on a day-to-day basis, to adjust training, for example, I think the morning is a better time. And that is not just because of the timing, but also because of the second reason that I wanted to bring up, which is due to body position. So when you sleep, of course, you are lying down. But then when you measure in the morning, you have different options. So you can also measure lying down, but you can also sit and stand. And when you sit or stand, basically you use what we call the orthostatic stressor. It just means that you change body position. And as you change body position, of course, there is a physiological response to that, right? Blood is redistributing, so things happen in your body that make it so that if you measure shortly after, let's say within a minute from when you sit up, then this measurement is more sensitive of your stress response. So it becomes, again, more useful because if you are sleeping, you're in a highly parasympathetic state. And that means that you really need, again, a strong stressor to change your heart rate and HRV as you sleep. But then when you sit up, you're stressing a bit your body. And if you measure shortly after, then the stress response is amplified. Even, if sometimes you're getting a bit sick, maybe your night heart rate, even just we look at, is 1 or 2 beats more than normal. But then you sit up and the body really struggles to readjust quickly because of that issue that you have that was not so obvious in the night data. And your heart rate might be 10 beats higher instead of 1. So you can really see a much more marked difference. And that's another reason why I think for assessing stress and guided training, especially for athletes, when you want to really look at training stress that is a bit more subtle than other lifestyle stressors, it can be useful to do it this way.
So the measurements in the night or through the night is a bit more reactive, and the one in the morning is a bit more proactive. That gives you something to
Yeah,
act
you can
on.
use it more to, exactly for actionability, I think. While the other one, maybe you learn something about your lifestyle. Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of gives you the report, so to speak.
Yeah.
When someone does it in the morning, what is the best position to do it? Generally, I mean, if someone doesn't sleep with their phone in the bedroom, and assuming they have it in the living room or somewhere else, and they would have to get up and go to their phone, or maybe they might have to use the toilet first before they check their HRV, depending on how urgent that toilet use is. What would be the best position someone should get themselves into when they do the morning test?
Yeah, so I think the important parts are when you wake up, as you said, if you need to go to the toilet, go, because that's something we should do before the measurement. I would say the only thing we should do before the measurement, because, eating, drinking, everything else later, checking your email, whatever, like any physical or psychological stressor, we postpone it, right? But then if you need to go to the bathroom, go, and then go somewhere quiet, sit and take your measurement. I prefer sitting to standing because it's just, we want to use that orthostatic stressor that we said earlier, but we don't want to overdo it, right? Sometimes you just woke up or you're sitting or lying down and you stand up. It's a large change. It seems trivial, but it's a large physiological change. And then that means that also the timing of the measurement needs to be more standardized. Because if you wait 15 seconds after standing up, or if you wait a minute, it's a large difference in your response. While typically if you sit up, it doesn't really matter. So it's just simpler to do it that way. So how I do it, I wake up, go to the bathroom, go to another room, put on the strap, or use, the phone camera, depending on if I'm, what phone I have or what I'm using, and then sit up and take the measurement.
So you recommend sitting over lying back down to take the
Yeah, for
measurement?
sure. Yeah.
In the app that you develop, HRV for training, there's an option of having two readings, the RMSSD reading and an extrapolated HRV. Is it a HRV reading? What's the reason of having both?
Yeah, so I would say, honestly, if I had to do it today, I would just put RMSSD. I developed this 15 years ago, and then I used a logarithmic transformation, as we said earlier, because that's what was done in scientific practice, and then used this score to simplify things, because the logarithmic transformation multiplied by 2 ends up more or less on a decimal scale. So that's easier probably to use as a metric with respect to RMSSD that goes from maybe 10 to 250. And for a person will be anywhere in that range. Okay. So it was just a simple transformation, but the two numbers carry exactly the same information because they are both, one is RMSD and the other one is derived by RMSSD. So if you look at day-to-day changes, normal ranges, variability, everything is exactly the same in terms of the trends. So it doesn't really matter for the interpretation of the data in this case. But yeah, it was back then, I would say it was not common to show RMSSD. It was more of an advanced things, and we were simplifying HRV. And then I would say, fortunately, RMSSD has become something that we just show because it's simpler to have everybody do the same thing. And now everybody's doing that, while before there were all the HRV features. So I think it's just happened that way, but it doesn't really matter for the interpretation.
So if someone starts using the app now, would you suggest they just look at the RMSSD and not the HRV?
Yeah, it doesn't really matter because, again, they carry the same information. So, but if they want to know their HRV, so to speak, now when people talk about HRV, they really mean RMSSD. So if they want to see that, then they can do that in the app as well. So it is there, but for the interpretation of the data, again, it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about sex differences in HRV. Is there any meaningful differences that exist between male and female athletes?
Yeah, so there are some differences. I would say that in terms of HRV, from research, we see typically that women might have a slightly higher HRV until menopause. And this is somewhat counterintuitive in certain cases because women have also a higher resting heart rate. And then, as such, you could expect that HRV is a bit lower. But clearly, again, there are differences between what heart rate is telling us and what HRV is telling us. And HRV is probably more influenced by hormonal changes and differences in hormones between men and women, because we can also see that after menopause, some of these differences are reduced. And then the HRV data of men and women after menopause tends to be more similar with respect to before. And at the same time, we know that there's changes in HRV for one person over time associated with changes in hormones due to the menstrual cycle. So also there we have fluctuations. And so there's a link quite obviously there, which shows that HRV data is also tracking these changes, and that of course differs between people that have a regular menstrual cycle and people that don't.
And during the menstrual period, would a woman expect to see a higher or lower HRV if all things else is constant?
Yeah, so in theory, during the luteal phase, we have a suppression of HRV, and during the follicular phase, it should be a bit higher. But just like for any other factor, there is so much individual variability that you can see this trend if you average a lot of people, and then it's quite obvious that there is this change. But if you look at the data of a single person over time, because all stressors happen at the same time, then it is not so obvious. Because again, there is psychological stressors, there is physical stressors, all sorts of things, and there are hormonal changes. So all of these things play a role in a way that there is so much individual variability that it's not so easy then to see these changes. Also for the same person, different cycles could be different because again, different stressors could be present. So there is a known relationship, but it's not so obvious in the data.
We talked a lot about endurance training and HRV and daily stresses, life stress and HRV. What about strength training?
Yeah, I think in the older days, there was a bit of resistance, let's say, in certain communities to use these tools because it was thought to be only something for endurance athletes because maybe of the link, presumably, between heart rate variability and aerobic capacity or the type of training that you do that is more associated to those type of changes. But again, HRV is the influence of the autonomic nervous system. It is also starting from the central nervous system, and the nervous system is involved in everything that we do, and that, if you don't train, HRV is still meaningful. So strength training is just another stressor, and so as such, It will impact your data. So to me, it's pretty much the same thing. If you overdo it with your training, there's also a nervous system component there, quite obvious. So in those cases, you might see it also in the data. There are some studies also showing differences when you look to isolate the session. So you measure before and after. You can see suppressions in RMSSD like you do with endurance exercise. And we said earlier, actually, that if you run or cycle below the first threshold, your HRV would actually be the same or increase after. So it's not that if you don't see a suppression, the training didn't impact your nervous system. It just impacted it differently. Because in that case, it is low intensity training. We could see it as a positive impact on the nervous system. We see that also through cortisol, that is basically reduced when you do low intensity training. So again, it's not that the training needs to create a negative disruption in your body for the metric to be tracking your training correctly. And I think that's a bit of a misconception. And we can use the same tool for, whatever activities we do.
Before I ask my last question, if someone wants to find out more about you or wants to follow your work or even wants to apply to be coached by you, how can they do that? Do you work with everyday athletes? Do you only coach elites?
Yeah, I work with, let's say, any sort of runner, meaning the sport needs to be, there needs to be a running goal. So people then do all sort of cross trainings and things and, are more health oriented or performance oriented, but running is still the main aspect, I would say. But then the level does really matter. So if, there is a genuine interest in the work I do and working together, I coach people any level. And in general, they can find me on Substack. I think that's where I write the most these days, especially in longer form things associated to the work I do, heart rate variability, as well as coaching and training and endurance coaching and things like that. So I would say my Substack. So if you look up my name and Substack, you will find it very easily. That's where I have most information and also where you can contact me easily.
And for HRV for training, I believe that it's on Android and ISO, right?
Yeah, that's right. So it's on both platforms. Yeah, on both stores. So the app can be found there. And that's something you can use for your morning measurements with a flash camera or with an external sensor like a chest strap, which I think remains, of course, the best way to track. But also optical sensing for most devices is pretty accurate these days.
And it's so much easier.
Yeah, true.
My final question for you, Marco. And this is the final question I ask all my guests. What does endurance mean to you?
Great question. Well, I would say for me is the ability to do what I enjoy the most for a long time, which typically means, being out on the trails somewhere and feel good throughout it so that, if I leave at sunrise and come back at sunset and I still feel like my body is in a good state, that's a day that makes me happy.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing so much about HRV, and thank you for being with me today.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
If there were topics in this conversation that you'd like me to go deeper into with this guest, leave them in the comments. If there's enough interest, I'll invite the guest back onto the show and dedicate an episode to a deeper follow-up conversation. Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next episode.